Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Lemon. I'm the director of Columbia Global Reports, which is a book publisher at Columbia University in New York City. We're here. Some of you will have come to our events before, some won't, but we always do these events when we have new books, and we have a new book coming out on April 4th. It's called Flying Green on the Frontiers of New Aviation by Christopher de Bellaigue. And he'll be on in 1 second to talk about the book. And we'll have two other people on this show. And they are Pierpaolo Cazzola, who is with the Columbia Global Center on Global Energy Policy at our School of International and Public Affairs, and Jeff McDaniel, who is the Vice President of New Projects at Velocys, which is a green aviation, we'll explain what that means in a minute, company in Columbus, Ohio. So welcome everybody, and thanks for being here. Let me say just a word about Columbia Global Reports before we dive in. We are first of all, this is Christopher's book, and our books, as you can see, are small. We do small books on big topics. They're meant to be, as appropriate for this event, something you can read on a longish plane flight. But they're on big, ambitious topics. And we try to pick topics that come from all over the world and that, in our view, aren't getting enough attention already. And we try to bring them to the attention of the public. Flying Green is our 41st book, and we've published on all manner of topics from all over the world. There's many more good ones in the pipeline. We're a not-for-profit, so we are grateful to anybody who's here who's been a donor to us. And if you want to become one, look on our website, you'll see how. So, Christopher, let's start with you. Well, you know, engineers like to say, you can't do anything unless you start with a problem description. So in this case, let's start with the problem description about aviation.
The problem is that aviation is growing. Everyone loves to fly, which doesn't sound like a problem until you realize that it's contributing to climate change in a way that many people don't really appreciate. It is 2.5% of the carbon emissions that happen as part of global humanity's climate change emissions, but also about about 1% is made up of other things that airplanes produce. So that's about 3.5% of human-induced global warming is caused by civilian aviation. And that is set to grow. And here is where the problem is. More and more people want to fly. That's a perfectly reasonable, it's a perfectly justifiable aspiration. And the industry is geared to allow that to happen. But the industry has not geared itself to decarbonization in the same way that other industries have. And so relative to other industries, almost every other industry, aviation is behind on decarbonization, but it is ahead in terms of the way that it wants to go forward and the way that it wants to add volume. So that, in essence, is the problem.
Right. So the 3.5% is significant, and if we're on current trends, likely to grow in the future. So let me first skip to Pierpaolo for a minute and then go back to you. Can you talk about, in the larger picture of climate change and attempts to reduce carbon emissions, how big a part of the picture is aviation?
Yeah, aviation is a significant part of the picture for Christopher just mentioned. So it's experienced strong dynamics. It was growing 4% per year before COVID, and is now catching up, reaching the same kind of levels of total activity that it had prior to COVID. And so there are questions open on whether this is going to continue, to which extent, but the expectation is indeed that aviation will continue to be very appealing. And so the trend in the space that aviation is destined to occupy in the overall amount of emissions is something that also, because there are greater expectations in terms of possibility to decarbonize other sectors, is something that is expected to remain very relevant and grow in the future. So it's going to be key to act on a number of fronts, which are, I think, well outlined in the book, and deliver in ensuring that aviation will be also following the path of decarbonization that we want to achieve in other sectors. So that's really crucial. I would say in terms of weight, aviation in terms of direct emissions weighs roughly like the shipping sector. But there are effects related with aviation emissions that, due to the fact that the emissions happen in high altitude, that make emissions due to aviation leading to greater climate forcing impacts. So global warming is more important in that respect. There's like an enhancer of the weight of aviation emissions in comparison with emissions taking place at ground level. So that's something that ultimately, even though in terms of fuel consumption, aviation weighs roughly like shipping, in terms of emission, aviation is actually heavier. And that's another element of concern that really puts quite a bit of pressure on having to act on it.
Christopher, I want to go back to you for a moment. So you yourself, as I have the impression, flew on a lot of planes when you were doing this book. A good cause, of course. The book, the heart of the book is a really ambitious repertorial journey, really all over the world, where you locate and visit people who are trying to solve the problem of highly carbon emitting aviation. So could you just tell us a little bit about, get back into the details, but just kind of how you did the reporting for, how and where you did the reporting for this book and how you found your subjects?
Well, the decarbonisation of most other industries is fairly straightforward. A pathway has been identified, and it's a question of how quickly that pathway is adopted, the money that's involved, the government incentives that are put in place, and then the response from consumers. Aviation is quite different. The pathway has not really been identified or agreed upon. And so what you find in the paper Flying Green is several different pathways, all of them, many of them very different from each other in terms of the physics and the chemistry involved, but all aiming to do the same thing, which is to decarbonize aviation. Now, you can look at this as a kind of competition, and I went to see the various competitors. I went to see representatives of different pathways to decarbonization. Or you can see them as part of a general effort that needs to succeed. They, in fact, all need to succeed if aviation is going to decarbonize, because we're looking at a long time frame here. And generally, the most effective technologies towards decarbonization are those that require the most amount of money and will take the longest to achieve. The least effective ones are the ones that are available now, either because they're not so carbon, either because they're not so climate friendly, or because they will take a long time, or because it's unable we don't yet have them at the required scale. And so I went from electricity, from full electric to hydrogen, different kinds of hydrogen propulsion, different kinds of SAF, electrofuels, sustainable aviation fuels made from biomass, even helium. All of these different things are in play. And I would say that they all, to some extent, need to succeed if aviation is going to go net zero, as it proclaims it wants to do by 2050.
Jeff, let's go to you. Jeff is actually a character in the book. He appears as somebody talking about the work of his company, Velocys. So if you could tell us just some of the history of Velocys and what you work on and where you're aiming to be in terms of solving this problem?
Yeah, so if you think about different options for greening aviation, there's three, I think, primary pathways that folks focus on, and that is a better fuel, batteries, and then hydrogen. Our company is focused on developing a better fuel, and there's a whole range of different types of better fuels. Our specific focus is taking non-food biomass, so things like wood trim, the pieces of a tree that you can't convert into lumber, and then chemically converting that to a multi-step process into an aviation fuel that can be used today. So I was part of the founding, I was a founding member of this company now about 20 years ago. So it's been a long journey. We've had to go through multiple demonstrations, and the next step for us is actually would be financing and constructing a large facility, actually two facilities we're targeting, one in the UK and one in the US, that would use these sort of feedstocks to produce aviation fuels that in our case actually would have zero or negative emissions. That's not the case for all fuels, but that's the potential that's out there.
So right now, today, if I want to fly somewhere in my Gulfstream 5, I can't use your fuel yet, right?
If I were producing my fuel, you could use it. It's fully qualified and certified, but I don't have it sell. There's only a couple refineries out there today in the world that are producing a sustainable aviation fuel. And those are what we call a first generation type of fuel. It's something that converts some type of plant oil or fat or grease, anything from a soybean oil to used cooking oil, into this aviation fuel. And those products are being sold, albeit in very small quantities compared to the total amount of fuel being used by the aviation industry.
So, Christopher, can you give us a kind of mini tour of, I'm going to divide this into parts, but the part I want to talk about now is the fuel part, that chapter of your book. People like Jeff who are working on, alternative fuels that would fly, that would propel planes and jets. So who are some of the players in that field, and what are some of the models for what would power aviation beyond, what we have now, which is jet fuel, aka kerosene?
Well, possibly one of the cleanest and the most interesting routes to this kind of new fuel is something called electrofuel. And this is something that I went to Switzerland and Germany in order to investigate. And I saw the different elements of the process that then later on be combined. And actually now in Norway, there is now, we now have the news of a plant which is being set up will do the following in order to create aviation fuel. As a non-scientist, I find this incredibly interesting. So basically what you do is you use direct air capture to get CO2 out of the air. And then you use electrolysis to get hydrogen. And then you use a reaction called the Fischer-Tropsch reaction to create a hydrocarbon, which is in its essential properties exactly the same as the kerosene or Jet A fuel that you put into the plane today. You need to use renewable energy in order for that to be green. And you need to combine all of these elements. And as I say, this is going to happen in Norway, and a company called North Sea Fuels is going to be doing this. One of the problems with this is that we've got a whole load of industries trying to decarbonize, and there's a lot of call for electrolyzer capacity. There's also a lot of call for, there's a lot of demand for renewable energy. And this is incredibly energy in this way of producing fuel. And I was told that in order to fly across the Atlantic and back again, you would need, in order to create this fuel, you would be using the same amount of electricity that the average household in the United Kingdom uses in a year. So that's an idea of where we stand at the moment with the electrofuel. Jeff has given us an idea of his version, which I find very compelling because the carbon intensity of the Velocys technique is so good. You actually end up withdrawing carbon from the atmosphere, and you're absolutely not emitting, but you're in fact withdrawing. There's another route which is I visited a company called Lanzajet in Georgia, and they will have a plant starting production, I think at the end of this year or next year, which is essentially processing ethanol from Brazilian sugarcane and turning that into jet fuel through a process called alcohol to jet. But basically, what they have in mind is the vast resources of reserves of corn ethanol that the United States has, and which it currently puts into automobiles. So when automobiles go fully electric, which we know the pathway, we know it's going to happen, then all of that could go to the aviation industry, or at least that is what fans of the aviation industry want to do. And just to finish off here, I think one of the things that you will have gathered from this little overview is that there's a lot of competition because, you know, a lot of other industries would like to be using the corn ethanol. A lot of other industries need the renewable energy. So it's a big competition, and aviation is not the most critical industry that we have. It's considered by many to be marginal. So whether aviation can use its elbows to get in and get all this resource is a question. It's more of a political question.
Let me ask you, Pierpaolo, to assess the various alternate fuel options. I think for the purpose of this show, we can stipulate that Velocys is the best. But so leaving that aside, which of these do you think will come into wide use most quickly and efficiently?
Okay, so I think this is a bit of a difficult call. What I can say is that one of the options, the most traditional ones, is what relates with the biofuels. This is also right now very much in focus, especially in the US, given the potential of producing domestically the biofuels. Less so, for example, in the European debate, where there's a lower chance to rely on as much biomass. Biofuels have the advantage of being, let's say, more proven as technologies and costing less in comparison with alternatives. The main alternative is at the moment probably e-fuels. So these e-fuels, the idea, the description that Christopher gave, I think is clear. You basically combine the CO2 from the air. You need to first capture it. There's less than 1% of CO2 in the air, so that's a bit of a challenge. And then you need to transform it to carbon monoxide and combine it with hydrogen, which you need to produce. And the whole process is very energy intensive. So you can do that at affordable costs only if you manage to have very, very low cost electricity, very low cost energy. So in places where you have a huge renewable energy endowment. And at the moment, we're not producing this at scale anywhere. Potentially, they have lower impacts in terms of land use change, which is one of the issues of biofuels. So if you have more demand for land to produce energy, that comes on top of what you already need for producing food. And so eventually you may end up displacing other parts of land, which are, for example, used for forests. And that may end up actually being counterproductive for abating emissions, because forests are actually absorbing emissions from the atmosphere. So once biofuel needs to be careful, the lower land requirements for e-fuels are attractive. The poorer energy efficiency, the higher energy demand is a big challenge. So I would say those are the main things on the table right now. Then beyond those, you have using hydrogen directly or eventually electricity through batteries. We mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I want to go back to that in a minute. So we'll cover
okay, And then one alternative still is combining some of the technology we discussed, in particular the direct air capture, with the idea of sequestering the CO2. But that's a different category. It's no longer making a fuel viable to fly, but it's finding a way to compensate for the emission of flying. So, but I guess this is also a topic you want to cover separately.
Jeff, I want to ask you a somewhat related question, but not entirely related, and that is, you know, the Biden administration has passed major legislation that is billed as aiding our energy transition away from fossil fuels. Maybe it's just me. I have the sense that a lot of people know that a series of big bills passed, don't have a clear idea of exactly what's in there. What, if anything, is in there that would or might address this problem of aviation and climate change?
Well, gosh, Dan, I'm surprised you haven't read all 876 pages of the Inflation Reduction Act. So, but most folks have, and I'll let you know, there actually is some language. There is quite a bit of language in renewable energy. I see significant uptick across many sectors related to the new targets and incentives that are included in the Inflation Reduction Act. And some of those are specifically designed to support the advancement of sustainable aviation fuel or SAF. And so for the first time at the beginning of this year, where there was a SAF tax credit, there's a specific credit to help support the advancement of these new aviation fuel projects. And they're having an impact. We've certainly seen a significant number of announcements of new projects, either retrofits or changes in plan based on the targets that are out there. Now, I'd say there's some concern in industry, like we have and others, that the specific incentive setup for SAF are not as long-term as they are for hydrogen and some other segments, but it's a significant starting point. And the final thing I'll say on that is about these incentives is they're not based on the quantity of fuel you produce alone, but it's based on both the quantity, what they call the carbon intensity, should we say, the measure of goodness. And as a relative example there, for petroleum-based aviation fuel, it would have a carbon intensity of 90. I'll spare you the metrics that are used there. For first generation fuels, the ones produced from crops, so they typically have a carbon intensity around 60, so that's a 3% reduction. Some types of waste oils can get down to 30s. Our fuel is one of the ones that can deliver a negative carbon intensity, so we put away more CO2 than we release, and therefore the fuels actually perform better, get more incentives. And I think that really is helping the industry focus on what matters, which is reducing the CO2 and the associated GHG emissions from aviation. So it's a big deal, and several other countries are looking to follow or somehow replicate what the U.S. is doing.
Do you and other people in the industry communicate directly with the Biden administration, or does this kind of, you read about it in the papers and comes as a surprise to you?
Both. So Velocys is a small company, so I don't have a direct line to President Biden. But what I would say we do is we actively work with others, coalitions, to try to shape a policy that makes the most sense, that'll have the biggest impact. So that involves everybody from the producers to airlines to other parties who are involved in the process. But at the end of the day, there's parts of the provision that came out that were just a surprise to everybody, other than the few politicians who pushed the legislation across the finish line.
Okay, back to you, Christopher. So talk to us a little bit, if you would, about hydrogen and electricity-based flying options.
Hydrogen and electricity, all of the things that we've been discussing are probably appropriate for different mission lengths. So electricity is probably going to be useful up 500 kilometers, and hydrogen could be the kind of mid-range, so 1,500 kilometers or something of that kind. And there are two things you can do. I mean, hydrogen is a wonderful thing. It's very abundant. it has a lot of energy. The problem with hydrogen is that it is very voluminous. It takes a lot of space. And in an airplane, that space is something you want to be filling with human beings or with luggage or cargo or something of that kind. So everyone is dealing with hydrogen has to get around this. And the way you do it is you basically got to redesign the plane. So that's clean sheet technology. The aviation industry doesn't like it. It's very expensive. Quite a lot of regulatory hoops to leap through. But that is what, for example, Airbus are now committed to doing. They're committed to having a hydrogen plane flying 200 people over medium distances by 2035. Whether they'll achieve that or not is something else, but that's what they're going for, and they're going to be doing it with a plane that may look very different from the kind of plane that we're used to flying into today. Now, the hydrogen has got to be green. That means it's got to be produced from water using electrolysis that is powered by renewable electricity. That goes back to the old renewable electricity problem. But you do have the chance of being carbon neutral. And basically, what you do is you put that hydrogen, you burn it, and it produces no carbon, but it does produce other effects that do warm the climate. The alternative to that is to use hydrogen and put it into a fuel cell, which is essentially a reverse electrolyzer, and it produces electricity. And so you're using hydrogen to produce electricity and flying your plane across the sky that way. There's a very interesting guy I met, very interesting company based in the UK and in the US called Zero Avia, which is involved in exactly that. Essentially, they're retrofitting existing small planes like a Dornier or a Cessna Caravan, and they're feeding hydrogen into a fuel cell and powering it across the sky. And they think they can do this a lot quicker than Airbus doing their burning hydrogen thing. And I read only today that Zero Avia are in consultation with various airports in the UK to run internal flights using hydrogen in the next few years. Again, there is regulation to get through. There's the regulatory hoops to lead through, but that I think is relatively hopeful. Electrification is kind of interesting because I devote quite a long, I think, quite entertaining chapter to a company in Palo Alto called Archer, which are setting up something called eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. And they're an amazing thing because they will not emit anything. They will carry people from A to B, short distances. You can't carry people further than short distances because the batteries simply won't allow it. And batteries have lithium has a great deal less energy than any of the other technologies that we've been discussing today. So it's a really interesting technology. But the problem with eVTOL is that they're actually encouraging adding a need, adding rather than replacing. So Archer are, I think they're setting up their first route from Chicago O'Hare into downtown Chicago. So they're not really taking people out of airplanes, they're taking people out of cars. And so they're flying cars and they're flying taxis. But of course, from a regulatory perspective, they are up in the sky. They're considered by the aviation industry. And the technology is extremely interesting. And if they provide impetus the way that electric vehicles, ground transportation provided to the development of lithium-ion battery, we've seen it with Tesla. If they provide impetus, a further impetus, more investment to get those batteries working better, then we could eventually see by 2050, but probably not before, fully electric airplanes flying, for example, from one seaboard of the United States to another. But it'll be the final frontier, fully electric airplanes. But it'll be the most satisfying and in some ways the greenest. Again, with one caveat, an electric plane is only green if the grid from which it derives the electricity, from which it's charged, is itself green. So the electricity has to be renewable. It can't be coal. It can't be natural gas or oil.
Pierpaolo, I want to ask you where kind of the big institutions of the aviation industry are in this story. The people Christopher visited and has been talking about are notably not working at Boeing, or I guess maybe more of them are working at Airbus. In automobiles, it seems as if, to this non-expert, that the major companies are pretty committed to, carbon reduction and carbon neutrality in automobiles. What's the story in aviation on the part of the manufacturers and the airlines themselves?
Okay, so I would say things have changed in aviation too. Things have changed in the automotive sector over the course of the past few years. I think COVID in particular has accelerated a lot of changes. There's greater financial pressure now to decarbonize, and this applies across the board. It applies also to the aviation sector. So I think the level of interest of airlines, or also aircraft manufacturer, has grown into all this space of low carbon technologies. Because ultimately, if aviation doesn't decarbonize, it's going to run into trouble in terms of having less opportunities for continue to thrive. So I personally see quite a bit of a difference. I see also investments coming from some of the airlines into securing fuel supplies, for example, and reducing investment risks for companies that want to produce the fuels. So this is something that 5 years ago was much less relevant than today. On the regulatory side, there are all major developments. Right now, we are in the final phase of approval of regulatory developments in Europe that are essentially requiring SAF to be part of the fuel mix, and a growing part of the fuel mix to very significant shares in the 2040s, 2050s. So this is also something else that really increases the certitude for investors that want to back companies that need to scale up their capacity to produce sustainable aviation fuels. And it's also, I mean, the example of Airbus working on the hydrogen plane, I think shows that also major players are looking into this space much more seriously. The ambition of Airbus, the stated ambition, is to get this plane potentially come into the fleet in 2035. Even if you look at the work done by ICAO and the scenarios developed by ICAO, ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization, you do see essentially big uptake of sustainable aviation fuels. You see a potential uptake of hydrogen in the 2040s, 2050s in one of the scenarios. So I think the level of acknowledgement of a need for action and the proactive movements that you see today in aviation are much more significant compared to a few years ago. So that, I think, is an encouraging sign. Having said this, it's very true that here we're talking about very complex technologies which are at a relatively early phase of commercial deployment. And so there's a lot of work to do. And I think it's important to see joint action by governments, by industry, sustainable fuel buyers alliances. There are also some kind of volunteer actions happening on the industry side to ensure that there is going to be willingness to pay some of the price differential that the fuels come with. So again, this is something that wasn't there a few years ago. And this is, I think, is a very encouraging sign.
Jeff, without getting into too invasive details, let me just say, I don't get carded in bars anymore. Am I going to live to see the day when all of what we're talking about is going to be part of my life?
Well, you certainly will. It's a matter of what degree. And so just as I say, you certainly will. So if anybody has flown out of LAX airport in the last 5 years, their jet when it took off had a tiny bit of SAF in it. And that's because LAX was the first airport to have customers who were receiving that fuel, and that fuel was being blended in amongst the rest of the fuel. And so every plane's just got a little drop of that. And really what the industry needs is a much, much steeper curve, much faster uptake. And as I said earlier, we're starting to see that. We're starting to see lots of investment occur. I do think the transition will start with SAF, because that's what has been proven. It's been validated. It can be done safely. Safety is a huge, as it should be, concern for this industry. So they won't do anything unless they're convinced they've done a testing to do it safely. And so that's a big part of what the other pathways need to do. My own personal view is I think we have just consistently underestimated the electrification in many industries. And so I think small planes that are electrified are going to take off faster than many people, anticipate, whether it's the type that Christopher talked about or just small commuter planes. Because again, if it's a short enough flight, the batteries, even though they're much, heavier than fuel, they can suffice. They can meet that needs. I think hydrogen for me is a longer but we'll see. Airbus and several others are making that as a thrust. There's an intrinsic advantages of hydrogen. It's just, as I look at it from an engineer's perspective, it's by far the hardest. And so, so that's my own view. The goals that they've set out in terms of trying to be net zero aviation by 2050 is very ambitious. And I think the next few years are really critical to see, okay, do things start to take off? Do we get some momentum? Are we able to realize some cost savings? Are we able to monetize the various carbon saving benefits, like through the SABA, the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Association, when people pay a little more to be able to have a zero carbon flight? Those are things that if we can start to make some real headway in the next few years, then maybe we can get on the trajectory and make it happen. But it's far from certain, and maybe better described as daunting to reach the sort of objectives that the overall industry has set.
So, Christopher, I just lost your picture. I hope you're still there. Are you there? No, well, maybe there you are. Okay, so let's go at this the other way, kind of picking up on what Jeff was saying. Another solution, and it's not, they both could be solutions at the same time, to the problem of the contribution of aviation to carbon emissions is just to have fewer people flying. As you said at the outset, people seem to love to fly and the numbers keep going up, up, and up. Is there any way to just get people, even you and me, to fly less or to want to fly less?
Well, I've been writing books for 25 years, and when I used to bring out a book, my US publisher would fly me over. And I'd go on a tour and I'd fly around the United States and I'd address panels and, audiences. And I'm not doing that now. I'm sitting here at home doing that. So that is something that I think is very positive. It's true that the aviation industry makes it very easy to fly. They keep prices very low. It's essentially an untaxed industry. Kerosene is not taxed. International seats, airline seats are not taxed. A lot of the airlines pay very little tax. So that what they can do is that they can drive prices right down, and they can reward frequent flyers. So I think we need to moderate our behavior. We need to fly less nonchalantly, and if we can, we need to find those carriers that use more SAF. We need to offset when we fly. Now, offsetting comes in different shapes and forms. You can pay for a surcharge, and some of the airlines will say, will you offset your that won't actually offset your emissions. So, but if you use a proper offsetting calculator and a proper offsetting company that plants trees that won't get damaged in the first wind or burned down in the first forest fire, or that are investing in solar energy around the world, there are lots of ways of doing it. It's about having a voluntary surcharge on your flight, and it will make you think more in a more considered manner about whether it's really necessary to fly and whether you want to fly. Because industry, as Pierpaolo has said, is coming to realize it has to decarbonize. But it is not doing so with any enthusiasm, because it wants to continue to grow. And while these technologies are developed, it doesn't want to lose their market share, and it doesn't want to lose that pursuit of volume. In 2017, I remember the head of Boeing said, look, 80% of the world has yet to fly. This is an industry that potentially has no limit. And that's very exciting from a commercial perspective if you're in the industry. It's also absolutely terrifying if you're thinking about an industry that has 20, 25 years to decarbonize it to a significant degree, and that is still growing. It's growing at 3% now. It was 4% before COVID. It's 3% now. And if it continues to grow like that, then even though they're being more efficient, even though they're starting to introduce different measures to decarbonize, emissions will continue to rise. And that at this stage in our global development is simply not acceptable. So yeah, we all need to think about flying and where we need to fly and whether there are alternatives. And if we do fly, we need to offset.
I'm going to start reading some of the questions that the people who signed up to attend this submitted in advance. And I can just throw them out without directing them to a specific person. And let's try it that way and see who wants to volunteer to answer first. And if not, I'll come in as the referee. The first question I think we just answered, which is, while we wait for these technologies to scale, does buying carbon offsets when flying make a difference? Answer, yes, Christopher, right? You just gave that answer. So I'll move to the second question. How much acreage is needed to implement these strategies? I guess that's a question for Jeff, or I don't know.
Well, what I would say is so one of the reasons why we use fossil fuels for a long time is a very cost-effective way of making energy. It's just that we weren't factoring in its full impacts from a societal standpoint. So with any of the various options, either it's through the production of the crop or the production of renewable energy, you'll use land. So that is kind of a fundamental driver. I don't have an acreage standpoint. What I will say, though, is the industry is recognized and does take into consideration things that they call like indirect land use effects. So what is the real impact of increasing the acreage or growing a crop instead of doing something else, and trying to set up the, incentive structure to reflect that. I guess maybe more fundamentally, I'm optimistic that that barrier can be addressed effectively, and therefore the shift to more sustainable aviation can do a lot more good than harm, is probably the best way to say it.
Can I also say something on this?
Yes, of course.
I do think the question is worth, it's important that there is an aspect of pressure on land use that exists, especially with some of the pathways. There are some other pathways that have lower pressures on land use. I think a key distinction is between biofuels using cropland or fuels based on waste, or which could be forest waste or agricultural waste, and e-fuels. And the pressure of the different options is not the same in terms of acreage. Clearly, the e-fuels have a lower pressure in that respect. There are also impacts on consumption of water that are relevant for crop-based fuels. So that, I think, on the other hand, for e-fuels, there are different limiting factors. We talked about the very significant amount of renewable energy. I could also mention the enormous amounts of air that need to be processed to actually capture the CO2. There's a professor in Cambridge that estimated the number of Trent engines that would be, which is like these big aircraft engines, would actually need to process air to be able to have enough carbon to make the fuels. But we're talking about something that, like a number of options that will face some limiting factors, in my opinion, one way or another. So there will be other elements of the solutions are also important. Energy efficiency of the aircraft, some of the technological developments that I think, for example, Airbus is putting in developing the hydrogen aircraft will end up anyway resulting in benefits in terms of making aircraft that are more fuel efficient. So reducing fuel consumption in the first place is probably the first thing to do. And that will help with some of what, like ensuring that we can fly, or at least we can fly more with the same amount of fuel that we consume today, or lower, but greener. So there are the acreage question, I think, just flags element related with the limiting factors that I think exist across the board, and they should not be underestimated.
Christopher, do you want to add anything on this one, or should I keep going?
No, I think I can add more answer.
Okay, and I don't know if anybody will have a take on this, but the next question is, do you think the Silicon Valley Bank collapse will impact future investment in green technology?
I've been asked that actually a couple times recently, and I think it's too early to tell. What I would say is, if the current banking crisis more broadly leads to a significant downturn in the finance industry, then yes, what happens is there's a big downturn, then there's a heightening of investment. The criteria that they use become more restrictive, and things that are innovative, first of kind, have some novel risk associated, they tend to struggle under those environments. But I think it's premature to say that's going to be the case. So we'll watch and see. I guess I remain optimistic that banking crisis can be relatively contained and doesn't have a spillover effect to the renewable energy space.
Others want to comment on this?
Yeah. I wouldn't mind adding one thing.
Please.
Not specifically on the Silicon Valley collapse, Silicon Valley Bank collapse, but on the key drivers that I think are behind clean tech in a way. So I think those will remain in place and will remain strong. There are energy security reasons why we're looking into this. There are geopolitical aspects, there are industrial development aspects, resilience of our own system in a changing environment where fossil energy will become more concentrated in terms of their geographical distribution globally. That I think these drivers will remain in place. And so the very fact that you have these macro drivers that will remain in place means that I think we're going to be bound to go past the episode now related with the Silicon Valley Bank and continue to be interested and continue to work towards trying to find solutions. And that's ultimately something that I think will help overcome whatever comes from like the immediate consequences of the bank collapse.
Christopher, do you want to add anything on this one?
I think that I agree with Pierpaolo. I think that the drivers towards investment in this kind of technology are only get stronger. But I think that perhaps in the short term there could be, as Jeff says, there could be a kind of increase in the risk of impulse among investors. At the end of the day, the direction of travel is very clear. It is towards decarbonisation, and there will be a flood of investment into there's a competition between the different sectors to see who can go fastest and where the returns are to be made. And I think that is where the plethora of possible pathways in aviation makes the jeopardy a little bit more when it comes to investing in this. Some of these some of these technologies could do better than others. And we've touched on some of the reasons why. All of them have advantages and all of them have disadvantages. So it takes very good, it takes luck as well as an investor to choose the right one.
Christopher, well, let me ask this a quick question, just that piggybacks on that last one. This is another and last of the audience questions. Who are the major investors in green aviation technology today? If you know. If I feel like you all either don't know or you're not telling because you're afraid I'll go start my own green energy company. So we don't have to go there.
Can you repeat that? I couldn't hear that.
I'm sorry. The question was, who are the major investors in green aviation technology today?
Well, actually, I mean, I've visited companies that are moderately well capitalized, and they have had several investor rounds, and I think it's a combination of green funds, also individuals who are themselves ideologically committed to this process. There is also investment from within industry. So in exactly the same way that an airline might purchase agreement to purchase a certain amount of SAF that they think is coming down the line, they might also invest in the company itself. And so you see the airline taking equity in some of the interesting companies. You also see interest from the larger players like Airbus and that kind of thing. And I think what may happen is that some of
Ooh. Okay, well, there it is.
Maybe the object of acquisition strategy by the big players, as happens with successful startups. We haven't mentioned something that we haven't mentioned, Nick, which is very important. I think it was alluded to earlier. Is the importance that will be attached to equity, and the companies that are sucking carbon and then burying it, like Climeworks, which I visited in Iceland, are also a tangential part of this story, and that is very important.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that point. Actually, for the facility that we're looking to develop in Mississippi, we're integrating the biorefinery with a carbon capture and sequestration field. So the CO2 that gets co-produced in the process is sequestered permanently. And that's part of what enables us to deliver a negative carbon intensity fuel. And I see that as being applicable for a number of the different production pathways, and as something that does hold a lot of promise, both in terms of just sequestering the CO2 directly, but then also the integration with the biofuel process, the renewable fuel process.
We're getting right near the end. I want to sort of pivot to one more area, Christopher, which is, one of the things about your book that I feel like we're not conveying enough is you met a lot of really interesting people, people who have started green aviation companies. You may want to cite a couple of them specifically, or you may not, but what drives these people? Why are they doing this with their lives? Are they dreamers? Are they practical business people, or what?
Very interesting. In some ways, these things reflect on where I came from when entering this field, because I'm a journalist by background. I've covered politics, I've covered economics around the world, but I'm also a historian, and I deal with trying to explain the past to people living now. And I think what probably unites all strands of my work is an interest in human motivation. I'm interested in the technologies that I described, but I'm particularly interested in the way that they intersect with the human beings who are involved in it and the human beings that we are who are going to be potentially consumers of them. I think what I find is a certain ability to stand outside the mainstream. There's a certain risk, an appetite for risk that I find among people that I dealt with, that in some ways is really quite inspiring. And there's also a sense of a mission to be part of the decarbonization story more widely and to contribute to a better world for future generations. There's an idealism there. I was particularly impressed by the Christopher de Bellaigue, for example, who I met in Zurich, who was telling me various episodes in his life and how he'd suffered from health and all sorts of problems, and that he felt absolutely compelled to do something. But then also talking to the highly intelligent, highly skilled, incredible brains that I met out in California with the eVTOL people. It was really a privilege to be in the same room as they tried to explain to someone of my very limited intelligence exactly what goes into making an eVTOL, and to try and convey that is, again, for a writer, a delightful challenge, something that I hope that I've, to a degree at least, pulled off in Flying Green. It has been a very inspiring, book to write.
Yeah, well, I thought you definitely did pull it off, and in a way, to be oversimplistic, but maybe not. The business people are really admirable in the book, and it's us consumers that are maybe less so, because we fly around at the drop of a hat and just, I mean, I know when I fly, I just shop like crazy for the lowest possible price, which is there's a real trade-off with that in the state of the environment. But the people that you met are amazing people, including Jeff, and really trying to make the world a better place. It makes you feel like all is not lost for humanity just to encounter these people. So
I agree. I'm glad you got that impression, because it's certainly the one I wanted to give. But I do think that we as consumers need to be more demanding. We need to demand more of our regulators, more of our government, and ultimately more of ourselves. And it is it's something that I'm trying to do as something like, and it's something we can learn to do. It's not difficult.
Well, you've inspired me to try harder. So I've been much better behaved as a driver than I used to be, and now I'm going to try to be more well behaved as a flyer. So you've got one convert, or someone who's promised to convert anyway. We have to wind up the show. Thanks to all of you for being here. If you want to buy the book or learn more about us, our web address is globalreports.columbia.edu, and check it out, and you can subscribe and get all our books if you want to, but there's lots more coming. Another one on flying from a different angle in the fall, and then on many other things. So thanks to all three of you for being here, and thanks to those of you in the audience for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Yeah.